If you were to be walking down the street and you saw a man fighting for his life, you'd have to ask yourself one question. What type of person are you, and how would you handle this situation? Well, there is one person who delivered this specific scenario, and that was Jesus Christ when he delivered his parable about the Good Samaritan. He spoke of a man who was nearly beaten to death, and there were three gentlemen who walked by this guy: a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And basically what it comes down to is, how would you inherit eternal life if you were any one of these three? Now, the main points that we're going to be discussing here for this is Jesus Christ's birth, a little bit of his upbringing that we do know about, and again, the parable that Jesus spoke of with the Good Samaritan. Dealing with the first point here, nobody knows the exact date, time, or year in which Jesus was born. The only thing that they have to go off of, and they believe, which came from Sauter, when was Jesus born, BC or AD, which was written in 2018, and she spoke of and writes that Jesus was born anywhere from 6 to 4 BC, and the only reason why they believe this is dealing with the whole time period of King Herod's death and what he had done with all the babies who were anywhere around the age of 2 years old, and he had them slaughtered, and he died shortly after. So that's what that whole time frame comes about. So the one thing that we do know is that Jesus was born in the city of Bethlehem, and due to the charge that King Herod had sent out to have all the babies killed or murdered, they moved out of Bethlehem and later into Nazareth. And the one thing that people do fall short of and believe is that Jesus Christ was born actually December 25th, when that couldn't be any farther from the truth. So his birth, if it does tend to stem that it's sometime during fall, coming out of summer into fall area, is where it's believed when his birth was. The only other stories that we hear of Jesus from a child was when he was a young boy, and he would go to Jerusalem, to the temples, and he would go there to learn about prophecies, the depth of the Torah, and essentially his father and what he had laid out for the soon-to-be prophecy that he would be fulfilling. And with that came him not only learning, but people were astounded by his schooling and how quickly he was learning. And it was even to the point to where he was teaching people. So Jesus was a boy, really a man among boys when it come to learning of God and the lessons that needed to be taught. And as we see, Jesus has grown into a man and has begun his ministry, and he has been tempted by Satan. So he was out in the wilderness, the desert, for 40 days, and then now he's using his parables to teach people lessons. The speech he taught in this day was the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we're going to go a little bit more in depth into. The parable of the Good Samaritan takes place in the New Testament, Luke 10:25 through 37. The first thing that we got to ask is, why was Jesus delivering this parable? And it was an individual that asked, how do we inherit eternal life? And his answer was, love thy neighbor with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, just as you love the Lord your God. And this certain individual said, okay, well, who's my neighbor? And this is where Jesus comes and delivers, okay, there is a man coming from Jerusalem to Jericho, and along the way he's beaten almost to death by thieves. Well, one man comes by who's a priest, a man of God, crosses to the other side of the road to go past this man and not even think twice about him. Then a Levite, which is, if you know anything about Old Testament, a Levite is the original priest. The Levites were of the son Levi, and they were in charge of all the holy things, the tabernacles, being priests in the temple and whatnot. So this man, who's supposed to be a holy man, holier than pretty much anybody, he goes and crosses the street and walks by. So then you have a Samaritan, and if you know anything about Jewish back then, Jews and Samaritans did not get along. They despised each other, but yet here's a man who put that nonsense away, put it aside. He bandaged his wounds, put him on his animal, took him to an inn, and would be cared for. And even before he left, he left the innkeeper enough money to care for this gentleman until he returned. So the question that you got to ask is, which of these three was his neighbor, and which were better, and which were no better than the thieves? The Samaritan was so good, and so he did it. Jesus was a man from humble beginnings who prepared his ministry from a boy to a grown man. He taught his parables to make his audience learn and have more depth in his teachings. It's just so hard to believe that we are that far from any one of these three men in this parable. The men in our lives don't need to be close to death. There's enough people on the street who are looking for our help. Homeless, sick, widow, veterans, and the list goes on and on. So at the end of the day, it is you who has to decide, what type of person are you going to be to your neighbor?